Hello everyone and welcome back into yet another edition here of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in on this lovely Wednesday afternoon and for our midweek edition of this week's set of shows. We should have a good one. We're continuing with our off-season guides for all the eliminated playoff teams, starting off with a divisional round participant and a wildcard round participant, the Bucks and the Rams respectively. Then we'll be doing, as always, our midweek NBA power rankings. Really excited about that. Could be some controversial picks ahead of the trade deadline, but it could be exciting after, the trade deadline and the events of the All-Star Weekend. And then we're going to play a little bit of a game here on the podcast, playing a little bit of NFL QB Matchmaker, seeing which potential free agent QBs could end up where. And then last but not least, an interesting segment talking about how the defending champion Boston Celtics, now in a 4-game winning streak, can head into the trade deadline. Already made a pretty astute move money saving wise, but how they could continue to navigate the trade deadline in its final hours and actually make an addition to their team that makes sense after the Jaden Springer move. But before we get into any of that fun stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you haven't done so already and want to keep up to date with new content such as this and all the shorts you release for our shows. But if you want to contribute and interact with our shows a little bit more directly, avail yourselves to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcpodcast.net, to leave any opinions, feedback, or input you have for the show, and I will gladly read them on air because I love interacting with you guys. Tips and donations are also genuinely appreciated, but anything you do for our network is genuinely appreciated by all. Just makes our shows that much more interactive and thus that much better as a whole. But without further ado, let us jump right into our first segment, talking more about some off-season guides here, specifically for a wild card team that looked like they could have made a deep run in the postseason as a dark horse, but ultimately came up short against the ultimate dark horse of this season's playoffs, the Washington Commanders. And it's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers we're talking about. This is a team that I feel headed into the postseason had a very interesting bent to them. They had a very dynamic offense led by Baker Mayfield in a swashbuckling style, and they had a lot of young talent stepping up in the absence of Chris Godwin. And for most parts of the season, Mike Evans did return for the postseason, but ultimately it came down to this young dynamic group, whether it be rookies, second-year players, stepping up on both sides of the football, that really made me excited for this Bucs team when it came to that wild card game, because I really thought that game, Bucs Commanders, were going to be one of the best of the playoffs, and it was. But ultimately, I thought the Bucs would win this game just because of the dynamism of that offense and how Baker Mayfield elevated the players around him that he had and didn't panic once Chris Godwin went down for the season. But now they're heading into an off-season where they really need to make sure that all these rookies that came in made an impact, guys like Jalen McMillan, guys like Otten, guys like Bucky Irvin, can continue to grow in their sophomore seasons and also really find out how to continue improving this offense now that Liam Cohen is gone. They did promote from within. Josh Grizzard, their former pass game coordinator, is now their new offensive coordinator. So we'll see how that really amps up what this offense does and really diversifies it. But ultimately, there's more work to do on the offense than the defense, in my opinion, even though the defense could use a little bit more youth in its ranks. But we'll talk about all of that right away, starting off with this offense, right? Because we don't really know how it's going to look, because one of the big questions is re-signing Mr. Chris Godwin. But ultimately, I think that one of the priorities that really came to mind for a lot of people after Liam Cohen was fired was who's going to be the offensive coordinator. Josh Grizzard now comes in, and I think that the continuity that he has in this Bucs coaching staff really gives it a nice kind of feel, even though it's kind of risky to promote from within sometimes. But I do like the hire. I do like the replacement just because it offers Baker Mayfield yet another guy invested in his quote-unquote career revamp yet again. But this is an offense, right, that under Cohen did average 28.6 points per game in 2024, which is actually the second most in franchise history. So keeping up that point total is going to be difficult next year without Liam Cohen, but if there's any offense I trust, it could be the Tampa Bay Buccaneers just because of how Baker Mayfield has improved his game. But it's not just all about Baker Mayfield. And it's not just all about the big question of re-signing Chris Godwin, which we'll get to in a minute. It's about this offensive line as well, right? Especially one of the bookend tackles that really improved this season, Luke Goedeke at the right tackle position. And re-signing him, this is the last year of his rookie deal, is vital for the protection of Baker Mayfield. And especially since he loves to create out of structure, and I could see more of that in his game next year. He had an 89.5% pass block win rate last year, really very much improved. And I feel like if you're the Buccaneers, you want to retain as much offensive line depth as well, because it's not just about the weapons that Baker Mayfield has at his disposal and how young or experienced they'll look next year, depending on the Chris Godwin situation, but it's about maintaining this line. This line has steadily improved. They're a line that includes Tristan Wirfs, one of the best tackles in the game, and can be very versatile. And Luke Goedeke improving this season really means a lot for their development in the years ahead. So in the final year of his rookie deal, look for the Bucs to try and get this deal done as quickly as possible to ensure that Baker Mayfield is as protected as possible and not just, always creating out of structure, because it's nice when he does, but you don't want it to happen too often, especially considering how many weapons you're incorporating into this offense. And then, now let's get into the Chris Godwin situation. This is a situation where, even though you can justify re-signing him, I don't necessarily think it will be the best thing, right? Because if you look at the weapons outside of Chris Godwin and Mike Evans on this offense, and you look at their age, I feel like there's very limited options. Yes, Kate Otten is a brilliantly reliable tight end, but how will he improve in his second season in the league? How about a guy like Jalen McMillan? If they do resign Chris Godwin, Jalen McMillan probably won't play with the same confidence he did without him, and ultimately he's a guy you might want to get more touches in this offense. But ultimately, I feel like the continuity of this Buccaneers team does matter a little bit, and I do think that they will re-sign him, but I'm not sure it's the wisest decision considering all the young talent you're bringing in, especially in the backfield. Bucky Irving really made a name for himself, and I do feel like in order to alleviate some of the pressure on Baker Mayfield, Grizzard might want to incorporate a more run-heavy set to this offense. And I feel like they have the offensive line capable of doing that, but ultimately it's going to come down to whether or not they feel like the youth they have in this offense really can continue to step up without a guy like Chris Godwin. Because while Chris Godwin and Mike Evans have been one of the most dynamic wide receiver tandems in the league, they're aging. They're in their 30s now. And you have to start considering, if you're the Buccaneers, who are going to be the replacements for these stalwarts of your franchise. And if it's Baker Mayfield who you're investing in the QB position, how does that factor into how you build around him as a result? So that's why I think this Chris Godwin situation is a little bit hairy, because if you do re-sign him, it adds a lot of value to maintaining that stalwart tandem of so many years. But if you don't, it gives an opportunity for these youngsters to feel freer in the offensive system that Grizzard is going to create. So it's a difficult conundrum. I say don't re-sign him just because I want to see what this team will look like if Jalen McMillan is given more of a chance at the wide receiver 2 position and Kate Otten gets a little bit more targets as well. But then on the defensive side of the football, they're also aging as well. There's a lot of youth in the secondary, and I like what they're doing. Antoine Winfield Jr. is still one of the best cover corners in the National Football League. Also can play safety, also can play in many versatile positions for that defense on the back end. But I'm looking at this linebacker unit, and I'm looking at specifically Levante David, who has given them many years of service, but will turn 35 this month. So, in terms of what I think about for them in terms of the draft, I really like the back end of this draft where they'll be picking in terms of depth in the front seven. And especially a guy like Jihad Campbell, one of the rawest prospects in terms of age in the draft, but probably one of the better defensive prospects overall you can pick up at any position in the draft. He can generate pressure from so many different levels. He excels in the second level. A sideline-to-sideline guy who I really like, who adds a dynamic feel to your linebacking unit because of the way that I feel the Bucs are moving. If you really want this team to get a little bit more youthful and a little bit more free in terms of their play, get a guy like Jihad Campbell, maybe move on from David and start trusting the youth you have and go all in that department. So I feel like as well they could potentially go corner to shore up that position group, because as well as a guy like Goedeke offensively who you want to re-sign, Zion McCollum is also entering the final stages of his rookie deal, and he's been an up-and-down performer for you. So maybe you look at a cornerback in the latter stages of the first round, but I would take a guy like Jihad Campbell, perhaps one of the most versatile players, and has one of the highest ceilings in the draft as well, due to his youthful age. But overall, the Bucs are off to a good start, because they immediately answered a pretty pertinent question by promoting Josh Grizzard from within to take over Liam Cohen's role as the offensive coordinator of this team. But if you re-sign Goedeke, I like that because you care about the protection of Baker Mayfield as well as the weapons around him. And whether or not you do or don't re-sign Chris Godwin, I still like the tenor of this wide receiving core, because it gives a chance to guys like Jalen McMillan. It gives a chance to a guy like Kate Otten, a brilliantly reliable tight end, like I said. But ultimately, I really think that this Bucs offseason is all about retaining players who you feel can add to the youthfulness of this team, and then in the draft, really diagnosing guys potentially defensively more so than offensively that can build on that as well. But let me know what you think if you're a Bucs fan, an NFL fan in general, about this Bucs squad heading into next season, what you think they need to do, because coming next, we transition to a divisional round participant in the Los Angeles Rams, a truly incredible story, especially considering now what's happening with them in the offseason and really what could happen in the future of a lot of different position groups around this roster. But we'll be right back after this short break to talk about it to a further extent.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Before we get into our second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you, as always, that if you want to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, GSMCpodcast.net, to better contribute and interact, like I say, with the show. Any opinions, feedback, input, even tips and donations that you leave are genuinely appreciated by all concerned, not just me at my own show, but others around the network as well. Go check them out as well. But ultimately just makes our shows that much better hearing from you, our faithful audience. But without further ado, let's get into our second off-season guide of the day, talking about a divisional round participant in the NFC, the Los Angeles Rams. Truly a remarkable season, a remarkable story. Obviously, starting off the season decimated by injuries, finding themselves at 1-4, then mid-season, getting a lot of players back, making a playoff push, ultimately beating out the Seattle Seahawks for the NFC West title, and then shocking the Minnesota Vikings. Even though they were the home team, Minnesota Vikings obviously came in with 14 wins in the season, shocking them at home. Well, not necessarily home, which is even more shocking, as they had to move the game from Arizona due to the LA wildfires. But ultimately, a truly incredible story. But now more than ever, this LA Rams team and its future is looking very murky, especially offensively. Obviously, we already know the news about Cooper Kupp. He's definitely going to be traded, but for who, it's going to be up for debate, and we're going to be talking about this for weeks to come if it doesn't get done immediately. But then as well, you look at this offensive line. You look at the future of potentially a guy like Matthew Stafford, who may only have a couple more good years in him. You look potentially at one of the only weaknesses on this defense, the secondary, and you ask a lot of questions about how this team is going to bolster those areas of need. But ultimately, it's more so about understanding the market and the value of some of the players you already have if you're the LA Rams in terms of how you go into this offseason. You already set the standard for a guy like Cooper Kupp, saying that he probably is going to be traded, most likely is going to be traded, and you told him as such. But now you have to focus on retaining some guys that you definitely don't want to lose, but also in areas that you can't afford to either, while also trying to bolster areas of need. Like I said, potentially a backup QB who can learn under Stafford for a little bit and potentially become your starter. And then the secondary, where yes, Cameron Kinchins was a nice find in the draft, but still needs a little bit of help at the cornerback spots. Without further ado, let's jump right into my analysis of what should happen for the Rams offseason to be a success. Starting out, like I said, not just with Matthew Stafford and Cooper Kupp, whose futures are very much up in the air. Not just Kupp's, but Stafford's as well. The offensive line, because the offensive line was decimated by injuries throughout the entire season. None more so than a guy like Rob Havenstein, who's a stalwart tackle in this offensive line. Injured his shoulder before week 17, ultimately didn't play as much as he wanted to in the postseason. But this is the last year, in fact, a non-guaranteed year left on his contract, and as well as Alaric Jackson, his fellow tackle, becoming a free agent. And then you have a guy in Bo Limmer who ultimately beat out a guy who we were really hoping to improve this season in Jonah Jackson. And now you have a very, very, very messy conundrum to deal with on your offensive line. The only good thing about this offense potentially is the fact that even if Cooper Kupp leaves, and potentially a couple of these old linemen leave, you still have a guy like Puka Nacua. But that's about the only hope you have if this starts to get a little bit messy and frustrating and complicated for LA. Because like I said, Alaric Jackson probably is the one guy you want to keep. He's the youngest of this bunch, and he played this season actually on a tender. So I do feel like he's going to be the hardest to sign, because he might want to be testing the market where he can get more high-end money as an offensive tackle. But I do think it's vital and integral for this team to keep as many O-linemen there as possible. And even though it's probably going to be the toughest to keep Alaric Jackson, he's the guy who's going to set the standard for you up front for years to come. And then, in terms of another group of need, maybe a more surprising group of need, how about this Rams secondary, right? We talk about how they improved this defensive front with guys like Jared Verse and Braden Fisk filling the shoes of Aaron Donald, not necessarily as individual players, but as kind of more of a collective team effort. But in the secondary, there are not that many pieces that you can build around outside of a guy like Cameron Kinchins, who was a pleasant surprise coming in the latter stages, I believe, of the 5th round. I was actually shocked he fell that far. He was one of the more intriguing safeties in that year's draft. But ultimately, a nice pleasant surprise, but you need to continue to supplement that, because the cornerback room was the most tested in the league, as they gave up 11.6 yards per reception. That was actually the 7th worst in the league last year. And if I'm looking at the breakout of the draft, the Rams are always going to be a team that's going to be picking at the low end of round 1. If I want to set the precedent for trying to develop young talent in my defense, and I'm analyzing the secondary and saying that we found a guy like Cameron Kinchens, how can we build on this? Then a guy like Maxwell Hairston, the cornerback position coming out of Kentucky, could be an interesting addition. He's not necessarily being profiled as a low round 1 guy. I feel like he's going to be more of an early day 2 guy, but I do think that as an instinctive guy with elite ball skills who finished with 5 pass breakups last year, I do think that he could be someone that they build around, especially if Cameron Kinchens continues to improve defensively as well. But ultimately, if I'm the Rams, I focus in on this offense, right? Because there are a lot of positives here. Because you saw when both Kupp and Nakua went down, the talent and depth you might have in this wide receiver room should one of them have left. And even during the season when there were talks of Kupp and potentially Stafford being traded mid-season, I feel like there was still optimism within the Rams about how some of these receivers were playing. Guys like Robinson, guys like Whittington potentially be stepping up should Kupp be traded. And now that it's becoming ever more real that Kupp is going to be traded, I do think that the Rams feel like they can compensate for it a little bit more, knowing what they have beyond Puka Nakua in the depth chart. So if I'm the Rams, I feel like if I can potentially get a little bit of draft capital outside of trading Cooper Kupp, then I feel like I can play around a little bit in this year's draft, maybe find a couple more hidden gems like they did last year, and bolster both sides of the football, especially offensively, where this tackle class is very deep, and maybe they want to take a chance if Jackson ends up going. If they do want to continue to improve the secondary, find more hidden gems in that department, then that's a route they could go, and Hairston could be a potentially eyebrow-raising choice that they are ambitious about. Or even picking a wide receiver themselves. Maybe this will come in the latter stages of the rounds, but ultimately the Rams can set themselves up nicely if they get a nice little package for Cooper Kupp. I'm not expecting a huge package, maybe a couple round 2 picks, maybe even a round 3, 4 pick in this package, but ultimately something where you feel like you can play around in the draft and find guys much like you did last year is what I'm saying. But ultimately the most intriguing matter for the Rams heading into this offseason is the quarterback situation, right? Because everyone felt like last year when they did pick up a guy like Stetson Bennett, that it was starting to become something that the Rams were beginning to monitor, right? How long Matthew Stafford had left in his career. And this year, I feel like now's a better time than ever to go out in free agency and potentially get someone to learn behind it, because I don't necessarily think Stetson Bennett's going to cut it. Maybe you dip into the well in the draft and a popular name being projected to the Rams, potentially, say, late in round 2, early in round 3, is a guy like Quinn Ewers, who definitely could learn the system a little bit more, and especially under Sean McVay, really develop and mature into a high-level NFL quarterback. But I do feel like there's more options in free agency for this team to really solidify and start to think about this QB situation once Stafford leaves, and especially if it's coming up sooner rather than later. So a bold prediction I could see happening for this Rams team, this isn't completely far-fetched, is that they trade for Kenny Pickett, and I feel like they draft someone so that once Stafford leaves, whether it be at the end of next year, 2 years or so, both Pickett and whoever they draft in this year's draft, whether it be Ewers, Dart, maybe taking a shot at Milrow or something like that, can grow as well. And then Kenny Pickett could be an interesting QB option as a bridge guy if Stafford's retirement is coming sooner rather than later, so that Ewers, Dart, Milrow, whoever, Gabriel even, Howard even, I'm not sure. Whatever avenue the Rams decide to take, if they choose to go that route in the draft, can learn more and more. So I think the Rams are in a nice little spot where at least the quarterback position, they have a lot of options available to them. But ultimately, I am concerned about the future of this offensive line more than anything. Because I think that if Alaric Jackson wants to test the waters, which he almost certainly can do, I feel like the Rams won't have enough money to keep him, and they won't want to splash so much cash on him either way. And I feel like that could lead to a lot more fallout amongst other guys like Havenstein, like a guy like Jonah Jackson, who ultimately lost his job this season. So look for the offensive line's future to get a little bit more complicated. But I do still think the sky's the limit for this Rams team. I really like the future of this defense. Maybe if they do go the route of corner, safety, what have you, in this year's draft, they can find a guy that really bolsters the secondary in both units, both the front seven and the secondary will be fascinating for the Rams. But I think that ultimately, if I'm a Rams coach, GM, owner, I'm thinking about what's going to happen with the future of this offensive line, because that could get a little bit worrying. Let me know what you think about the Rams' future in the comments. But coming up next, we transition to the NBA, talking a lot more about that before we transition back to the NFL, doing my midweek NBA power rankings. See you at the top right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone, welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, as always, we're doing our midweek NBA power rankings. Now, these power rankings are going to get ever more controversial as the weeks move on, especially at the end of the trade deadline. A lot of movement could be happening, but this is my personal list of the top 5 teams in the NBA right now. And no matter what, there are going to be a lot of skeptics on this list, but it's my personal list. Let me know what you think in the comments if you feel differently. But without further ado, let's jump right into it because it should be a good one. Coming in at number 5 on my list, perhaps the hottest team in the NBA right now, winning 8 straight, including against some top teams out in the West. How about at the number 5 spot, the New York Knicks? This is a really impressive team right now. The informed team, at the very least, in the Eastern Conference. 2.5 games now behind the Boston Celtics for the second position, even though the Celtics, we're going to talk about them a lot on today's show, have been on their own kind of winning streak of sorts, but 8 straight. They went 3-1 this past week against the West, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 seeds. So, as you can tell, this Knicks team really turning into 4. And if I'm hearing correctly about certain NBA trade rumors, they could be a team that has Kevin Durant as well on them at the end of the trade deadline. This would be crazy to behold because Jalen Brunson is already performing at a high level. Cat's been one of the best free agent additions in the offseason, now translating into the regular season that the Knicks could have possibly hoped for. And their most recent victory over the third-place Houston Rockets, we're going to be talking about a little bit later as well, and probably one of the most controversial teams on this list in terms of positioning. Brunson finished with 42 points and 10 assists, and to show that he's a dominant closer in the league, a dominant closing point guard, perhaps the best in the league. 17 of those points came in the last 6 minutes. So as you can see, the Knicks are truly rounding into form, dominating teams and good teams in that loaded West. Are you kidding me? Taking on the numbers 2, 3, 4, and 5 seeds out west and going 3-1 in that stretch is pretty impressive if you ask me. So this could be a team that's constantly rising, especially if those trade rumors are true. But for now, they sit at the number 5 spot. Coming in at the number 4 spot, a team we're going to be talking about a lot today, it seems like, the defending champion, Boston Celtics, who are now on a kind of surprising 4-game winning streak after a little bit of a cold streak at the end of the season, including an impressive, dominating back-and-forth game against the Cleveland Cavaliers last night. But I do feel that it made the trade deadline for Boston a little bit more confusing. A lot of people thought they were going to stand pat. We're going to be talking about how they can continue to navigate the final hours for the trade deadline in today's last segment. But I feel that this team now is rounding into form a little bit. They're starting to prove their mettle, including that comeback win over the 76ers a couple days ago. But they do have a tough schedule coming up. They do face Dallas. Then they're on the road at the Garden at New York. They're at Miami, who I don't even know what's going to happen with them in the next couple of hours. But ultimately, I feel like this Celtics team are probably going to stand pat after, the whole Springer thing, but we'll talk about how potentially they can improve. But I say this Celtics team is still going to be dangerous, especially headed into the All-Star break. I know that sometimes teams who are on a bit of a hot streak after a cold streak heading into the All-Star break might fall apart after it, but the Celtics really look good. And it's all going to depend on this 3-game stretch, Dallas, New York, Miami, in terms of how we feel about them heading into the All-Star break and coming out of it. But for now, they sit at number 4 on my rankings. Then at number 3, how about the Cleveland Cavaliers, the team the Boston Celtics beat last night? Still tops in, the Eastern Conference. And I feel like, they were a team that was in a little bit of a rough patch as well. They won a 3-game losing streak in a little bit. Then they reeled off 4 straight wins. And they outscored opponents by 104 points in the stretch. But that just goes to show that this Cavaliers team is more real than people even know. In a moment where they had lost 3 games, they hadn't even lost 3 games to start the season in their first 20. To come back and reel off 4 straight wins was really impressive. But let's talk about one of those wins. On Sunday, they beat the Mavericks in an astounding fashion, but that was ultimately after the news of the Luka Doncic trade had broken, and the Mavs were probably shell-shocked. But still, this is an impressive stat. Sam Merrill, an interesting depth piece for this Cleveland Cavaliers team, led the team in that one with 27 points, and he was the 7th different Cavalier to be the high scorer for the team. And this is a team with 3 East All-Stars. I'm really excited to see how they perform in that game as well. I'm really excited to see if Cleveland can build on this remarkable start to the season as the first place team in the Eastern Conference standings, probably going into the All-Star break because they have a very easy schedule. Only Detroit and Washington and Minnesota to worry about before then. But I'm really, really excited to see the tenor of this Cleveland Cavaliers season after the break. And so they ultimately sit at the number 3 position in my rankings. Then at number 2, this is where we get a little bit controversial, because ultimately I feel like this team has been in a bit of a rough stretch, ultimately losing to, of all teams, the Brooklyn Nets twice in the past couple of days. But I still think that this Rockets team are winners in a certain regard, because I feel like, this was often a team discussed in terms of how they might attack the trade deadline, trying to go for a superstar perhaps. But this is a team that really believes and trusts this young core of guys. They really trust guys like Jalen Green, Şengün, a guy like Amen Thompson, who we're going to be talking about a little bit more in terms of this Houston Rockets team as the season goes on. But I really, really, really like how this Rockets team is approaching their rapid rise in the Western Conference. This is a team, like I said, much like the number 1 team in my power rankings this week, that if you look at them, they're a team that very well could and might just add a piece in the coming stages of the trade-in line. But when I look at the depth and I look at the talent, even in this very weird, like I said, 3-game losing streak where they lost to, of all teams, the Brooklyn Nets, and a game a couple days ago in that crazy closing sequence. As much as those games really were bizarre and puzzling for this dominant Houston Rockets team, the reason why I'm still calling them winners and the reason why I'm still ranking them this highly in my power rankings is because they feel like they won the trade deadline by staying pat. By keeping this young core intact, you're saying that I don't care about these mega deals going on. I don't care about those discussions. And while we are hearing about all the packages they could have possibly sent, they haven't sent them as of yet. They could still potentially, mix it up in this purported Kevin Durant deal coming up. But ultimately, I feel like this Houston Rockets team are winners despite being on this 3-game losing streak. They're at Minnesota, they're at Dallas before that All-Star break and going up against Toronto as well. So not necessarily the hardest of schedules to compound this 3-game losing streak, but ultimately a schedule that they will feel like they can sink their teeth into and head into the All-Star break feeling good, especially if the core still remains intact. But I do want to talk about, before we head into the number one player in the ranking, a very special player for this Houston Rockets team, and that is the aforementioned Amen Thompson, a truly incredible player, perhaps becoming the Rookie of the Year, maybe even the Defensive Rookie of the Year for his excellent two-way prowess, but an incredible stat. On Monday, against the New York Knicks in one of the games on this 3-game losing streak, he became the third youngest player at 22 years and 4 days old to have a 20-point triple-double at Madison Square Garden since its opening in 1968. And yes, you can say, well, that's too bad that the Rockets couldn't build on that and really supplement this kid who's really being incredible. But I do feel like this is a Rockets team that are beginning to rely upon even more because of the trust ethos they've instilled in this young roster. They know their identity. They know that they can beat any team on any given day. And I feel like even in this rough patch, and even if they trade away a couple of these young players in a big mega deal, I still like this team because they're starting to come into their own. And even in this rough patch, they're going to learn from it. Look at my rankings over the past couple of weeks. A lot of these teams were in rough patches, ranked this highly on my power rankings. So that's why you should never really doubt a team like the Houston Rockets, like any team for that matter, in my top 5 in a rough patch, because eventually they get out of it. And I believe that the Rockets will get out of it. They have some tough road tests at Minnesota and Dallas in the coming days, like I said. But I really think that they've already won this trade-in line should all of these players stay with this group. Then at the number one position, obviously, the Oklahoma City Thunder. This is an incredible team, too. We talk about all the stats with all their different lineups, whether Chet's starting, whether Isaiah Hartenstein's starting, whether or not they're both not starting, who is playing center position, what kind of small ball lineups they're going to throw at you each and every night. But still, this team is incredible. And that man at the forefront of this picture is a big reason as to why. Potential MVP, if it weren't for Nikola Jokic doing crazy exploits, keeping this Denver Nuggets team afloat, he would be my pick. Shai Gilgeous is an incredible athlete, leading the league in points per game, and he's scoring in bunches. They've had a weird stretch, the Thunder, where they've won a lot of games in dominant fashion, but they have some puzzling losses to the up and down Warriors. They had a couple losses to the Mavs, sans Luka, which now hits a little bit harder saying that, but I do feel like this Thunder team, no matter what lineup they roll out, we constantly always say, still feel like they're the top dog in the Western Conference. Luka trade be damned. Because until you prove that you can beat this Thunder team twice or consecutive times in a row, until they go on a weird losing streak or something, I can't necessarily say that this Thunder's team will be down for long. Yes, they have some puzzling losses in the past couple of weeks. Yes, at some times, you might begin to question whether or not some of the injuries within this squad can pile up and really impact their play, because they do rely on a lot of their depth pieces. But I still believe more in the sum of the Thunder's parts than anyone else in the pundit world, because they've already proven that Shai is the ultimate facilitator, and if you build a good solid core around him that can supplement him and ultimately buy into certain traits that bring out the best in him as a player but also the team as a whole, then you can win a lot of basketball games. But the most impressive thing about Shai is that he had first 2 50-point performances of his career in a 4-game span late last month. he has scored in the past 3 games at least 30 points in the first half, including the rematch against the Bucks we talked about on this show. And he scored at least 25 points in the first half 3 times since January 16th, and only Jalen Brunson and Donovan Mitchell have tied him for the most times this current season to date. And I think that that's impressive, but looking at this Thunder team, they've also won the deadline if they keep this core together. And that's what I like about these top 2 teams, right? You might begin to question them if they lose a couple puzzling games, like they both have done in the past couple of weeks. But the reason why I still believe in teams like this, rather than teams like the Lakers and potentially the Mavs after this strain, potentially some other teams, maybe even the Warriors, should they acquire Kevin Durant, maybe even, say, the Suns if they actually get a good piece in this purported trade. I think that relying on a young core and standing pat is smart in today's NBA. It's team friendly, and most importantly, it allows for you to really grow as a team no matter what comes up in the next 5 years if you choose to stay intact. So that's why the Thunder and the Rockets still remain atop my rankings, despite the fact that they have had some weird losses over the past couple of weeks. But teams like the Celtics, the Knicks, can be rising up these rankings very rapidly. So look out for that movement in the future. But let me know what you think about my current rankings. Coming next, we look at a little game of NFL QB Matchmaker, talking about potential free agent QBs and where they might end up in the coming weeks. Be right back after this short break to talk about it.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our 4th segment of today's show, we're going to play a little bit of a game, returning to the NFL, but this time talking about some potential free agent QBs on the market and where they can land. Yes, a little bit of a game of NFL QB Matchmaker, if you will. And it's going to be an exciting cycle to monitor because some of these guys might feel safe in their standing with their respective teams, but others might be shrewd additions to QB rooms around the league if they move in the coming weeks. So without further ado, let's play NFL QB Matchmaker. Starting off with the guy who had an incredible season in Minnesota, potentially could leave. I'm not necessarily certain that he will, but if he does, he certainly will be a hot commodity in the market and could go to several teams. We already talked about this guy going to one team that I really think would be a nice addition, but how about him returning to the media circus that is New York? Yes, I'm talking about Sam Darnold potentially becoming a New York Jet yet again. And now I know this sounds a little bit more far-fetched than, say, him going to the Raiders now that Pete Carroll has made it clear that he might not want Russell Wilson there after all. But I do think that a Sam Darnold to Jets reunion would not be so terrible. Think about it. The Jets could be in QB purgatory depending on the whole Aaron Rodgers situation, and no one knows what the heck he's going to do. But I do think that with the weapons they have, and with Aaron Glenn at the head coaching position, even though he's a defensive-minded guy, he's going to want someone who can utilize all of these pieces in the Jets' offense to the best of his abilities. And that's what I think the mistakes of a guy like Robert Saleh were, that he didn't just allow Aaron Rodgers to utilize some of these guys to the best of his abilities, and he let Aaron Rodgers run the show. If Sam Darnold were the QB of the New York Jets, yes, a lot of questions are going to be asked about his former tenure there, but I still think that now he has a solid season under his belt. He proved that he can still be a solid quarterback in this league, and it would make a lot of sense because the Jets right now are not necessarily in a position where they can move up in the draft to draft a QB. And I don't necessarily think any QB in the latter rounds would appeal to them, and Sam Darnold could come cheap for you. So why not Sam Darnold to the Jets? As far-fetched as it may sound, I still think that he would fit better in Las Vegas because Pete Carroll, an experienced head coach, has worked with a guy a little bit like Sam Darnold in Russell Wilson and knows how to implement a guy into a roster that really utilizes a little bit more old school philosophies, and I think that will be very comfortable for Sam Darnold. But if the Jets want to make a swing at him, then so be it, because they really could be, like I said, in QB purgatory and might not have many options available to them in the coming weeks in terms of looking for QBs should, like I said, Aaron Rodgers leave, because we don't know what he's going to do. So this could be a completely moot point should Aaron Rodgers decide to stay, but this could be an interesting reunion for Sammy D in the future should it happen. And then let's talk about a guy who I think will stay with this current team and give them a completely new look to their offense. And I think that this would be potentially the best move that I mentioned in this segment, just because this is someone who the Pittsburgh Steelers brought in along with Russell Wilson, who was forced to start the season, went 4-2, knows this offense, but ultimately gives them a lot more upside as a similar kind of prototype of what Russell Wilson in his best years could give you, and that is Justin Fields. Like I said, he's a little bit more of a young Russell Wilson, like an old Russell Wilson. He still has elite arm strength. It's just, a matter of him utilizing it correctly and getting to that point. But like I said, if Justin Fields decides to remain with the Pittsburgh Steelers and they re-sign him and invest in him, this could very well be a very shrewd move, and an astute one at that, because getting younger at the position could be paramount for the Steelers. And why not, not risk, going into this QB cycle of drafting guys like, Kenny Pickett in the past and having him go through this cycle yet again of being a failure or a project at most in that system, and stick with the guy you signed in the offseason in Justin Fields, who played several games with you and really looked decent doing it. So, even though it might not be the sexiest option, and even though he might end up being a bridge guy, if the Steelers go the route of drafting a guy, whether it be this year or next year potentially, I feel like sticking with a guy like Justin Fields proves that the Pittsburgh Steelers want something new at the QB position and not just the same old. Because eventually you're going to have to start wanting to be competitive in this AFC North. You can't just skate by barely squeaking into the postseason and losing in the first round. You want to have some success, not just in the AFC North against these tough opponents, but later and later into the postseason. So Justin Fields gives you a chance of that. And if you want to draft a quarterback, it gives you a nice pathway to developing that young guy, whether it be in this year's draft or next year's draft for the future. So I really think that this would be perhaps the shrewdest move, not necessarily a big blockbuster deal that sees him go elsewhere, but a shrewd move that keeps the Pittsburgh Steelers as a contender potentially for the next couple of years, because of the fact that you're willing to go with something new. But let's get back into some movement here. This particular one is one that's perhaps the most popular that I've seen over the recent weeks, and potentially could happen in a trade, a like-for-like swap, so to speak. Kirk Cousins moving to the Browns. I forgot about that one, put in the graphic there. But ultimately, I want to talk about this one first before we get into Russ's movement, because Kirk Cousins to the Browns is the most popular kind of storyline we've heard with all of these QB movement around the league. But ultimately, I think it's going to be in a situation where the Browns potentially trade Myles Garrett for Kirk Cousins, because I think that would be a clever move on the part of both teams, seeing as to how the Browns could get, say, a quote-unquote bridge guy in Kirk Cousins, for whether they bring back Deshaun and have him play for another year, or they test, the free agent market, or, rely on someone in the draft. And then the Falcons get a elite pass rusher to really bolster that defensive front and stick with Michael Penix. And I think that would be a very smart, shrewd move for both teams. But ultimately, Kirk Cousins with the Browns could be a match made in heaven. I didn't really like how he looked this season, but this move could see him back with Kevin Stefanski, a guy he's worked with in the past in Minnesota. And I think that style of offense that they run in Cleveland really takes the pressure off of what he did in Atlanta, where he was in the pistol a little bit more, relied on him to move a little bit more in the pocket, and really putting pressure on that torn Achilles that he had last year. But if he moves the Browns system, it could be a lot more effective in terms of how stationary he remains and how it's more timing based. So I would really like this move if it even comes in a trade where Atlanta wants to get Myles Garrett and the Browns want Kirk Cousins, and I think it would work for both parties. But either way, I still think that this would be not just the most popular, but one of the best case scenarios for Cleveland, should they just want a bridge option for the season and still rely on Deshaun Watson next season as well, even though I think that would be a terrible idea, and a lot of people would agree with me. But for the final QB matchmaker here, this is one that would seem a little bit more far-fetched than the others, but I really think that it could work out, just because Brian Daboll is someone who would like a guy like Russell Wilson, even though he may not be in his peak anymore. But I feel like Russ to the Giants could make the more sense than Russ to Las Vegas, because I like how the Giants have an infrastructure at the very least in their wide receiver core, with Malik Neighbors and Wan'Dale Robinson and guys of that magnitude. But I do think the only thing separating this from being a far-fetched idea and a brilliant solution to the Giants' QB issues is that offensive line, because Russ has made it clear in recent years that if you don't have a solid offensive line, then I'm not playing for you. And whether it be with Denver and Pittsburgh, we saw that he got a little bit frustrated with, how many times he got sacked. And so moving to the Giants will not help in that department. But if he wants to work with the offensive mind in Brian Daboll, and he wants to work with weapons like Neighbors and Robinson, who really could become underrated wide receiver tandem in today's NFL, then I could see this move potentially working for all parties concerned. Now, obviously, there was questions about whether or not Pete Carroll and Russell Wilson would reunite, and that still could be on the table, even though Pete kind of shunned it. But I still think that when you look at the Giants' QB options, yeah, maybe Ward or Sanders falls to you at 3 in this year's draft. But really, if the Titans, the Browns, say, or even a team behind you like the Raiders are aggressive, then you might be stuck in a bit of a purgatory where you have to take the best player available. And the Giants have a lot of other areas of need outside of QB that would make me think that they will be fine if they didn't get a guy like Ward or Sanders at the top of the draft. So getting a guy like Russ and adding that veteran experience to this roster, despite the fact that he probably is going to be frustrated more often than not with this offensive line, then why not make that deal? I think it would be an interesting combination of Daboll, Wilson, and this receiving core in trying to get this offense really up to speed. But let me know what you think about all these NFL QBs and their respective matches. I think would be perfect for them. Like, coming up next, we conclude with the basketball segment, talking about how the defending national champion Boston Celtics can navigate the trade deadline in its final hours. They've already made a pretty shrewd move money-saving wise in the past couple of hours, But ultimately, let's take a look at how they can make even more and make it matter as a result as well right after this short break. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, and for our final segment of today's show, we return to the world of basketball, return to the topic of the trade deadline for a specific team, the defending champion Boston Celtics. When we talked about during our NBA Power Rankings segment about how the Celtics are likely to remain standing pat and standing firm with who they have heading into the All-Star break, I do feel that they can still navigate this deadline and potentially make some winning moves to better bolster their roster. They already have made a move before the show in terms of money saving and making a shrewd addition there because they are in the second apron in the luxury tax still, despite the fact they moved on Jaden Springer. But they do still have an opportunity to sign a 14th player over the next couple of weeks. In order to make that player count, I think that they need to address a couple of different areas of need. So without further ado, let's jump right into how the Celtics, a team that usually stands pat during this time because of the depth of this roster, can navigate the final hours of the trade deadline and end up bolstering their roster even more. Let's talk a little bit more about the Springer situation and how the fact that they can sign a second player or 14th player to this roster within the 2-week span can really ultimately help them, quote-unquote, win the deadline despite not doing much. So the Springer deal is purely for a financial reason, to save as much money as possible. They still are in the second apron of the luxury tax. They did only save about $60 million in salary and luxury tax by moving on Springer. They did get a couple picks in return for him. But in talking about this 14th player that they can sign, a couple of issues still remain for Boston. They have addressed them in their 4-game winning streak to an extent, but there's still worries if you're a fan of this team like myself and you want to see them mitigated. And so I do feel like they have a lot of assets that could move in a potential trade, but if I'm them, I'm sticking with the plan of signing a 14th player without much costliness to it. But let's talk about ways they can address that. I feel like the biggest issue for the Boston Celtics is obviously their bench depth. They have guys like Tillman, Kornet, Queta, Pritchard at the point guard spot, but they haven't necessarily been providing too much in the past couple of months, especially in that losing streak before this 4-game winning streak. So I feel like if you want more bench options, there are some cheap guys out there that you can compound them with. Then, obviously, I feel like the over-reliance on the 3-ball has not necessarily worked as much as it did last season. They haven't necessarily been shooting the best over the past couple of months. It has improved, like I said, over this 4-game winning streak. But if you want to maintain that success, if you're Boston, maybe picking up a guy who's a catch-and-shoot guy and can get going on the perimeter and thus space out the floor for this bench group a little bit more. That's a thing that they could address as well. And then that ultimately leads to the wing depth as well, because outside of, Tatum and Brown, it's Pritchard, Hauser, really, who are very much three-ball guys and live and die by that, who are leading this offense in the bench units. Derek White can really do that very well, but if he's getting more starting minutes and being key to, that starting rotation, excelling from three, then you're going to need to find another piece there. And there are a lot of cheap options out there. But if I'm the Celtics, I, at the very least, feel like I can go without signing another player. But because of this Jaden Springer move, I feel like they can do a lot of things very intriguingly with it. Ultimately, I think that addressing the depth at wing could be a lot more impactful than, say, addressing the depth down low, just because I like the tenor of those guys in this group. Tillman, Kornet, and Queta don't necessarily get the most minutes, but I do feel like they're more in the sum of their parts when you ask them to play a certain amount. Because, yes, there are going to be worries about the health of Porzingis and the age of Horford over the next couple of months and how that impacts their runs in the postseason going forward. But I still feel like wing depth is ultimately what's going to matter for this Boston Celtics team, because it's what they build their identity on. It's who they are as a group. They live and die by the three, and as long as Joe Mazzulla is their coach, that's going to be their MO. So a couple guys out there who I think can supplement them very nicely. So let's start off with a guy like Seth Curry. He's shooting 46.2% from three this year, and he could come off the bench and give them a nice floor spacing option, especially considering the fact that a lot of these depth pieces at the center spots aren't the greatest shooters, and more often than not like to drive to the rim a lot more. So, in, say, a third bench unit, a second bench unit maybe even, if Pritchard continues to struggle, I think Curry could be a valuable asset. And then a guy like Torrey Craig, very valuable not just in terms of his outside threat, but as a two-way player, proved it with his many years with Denver, and I feel like that could be an interesting pickup in terms of wing depth. Then let's talk about how I feel like this center group could be impacted, because in terms of their scoring prowess, they're going to be asked a lot in terms of, say, if these players start to get injured in the front court, like Porzingis, like Horford, a little bit more in the coming months. They were last in scoring, and bench scoring specifically, over the past couple of months at 29.7 points per game. And I think that stems down to the fact that a lot of big men who have picked up, like Shireman, who they believe can be a little bit more versatile in how he plays, obviously play a little bit more in small forward, power forward positions in college at Creighton, and then a guy like Drew Peterson, who's still in the G League. I feel like they are more project pieces, whereas Tillman, Kornet, and Queta are the path of least resistance, right? Because they're on cheap deals and they're on team-friendly contracts for as long as they can be and remain Boston Celtics, because you don't want to be spending too much. But I think that a guy like Javonte Green has a lot of depth as well, has a lot of experience to this roster as well, and not necessarily someone who, like Kornet, Queta, and Tillman, have the proclivity to drive to the rim more often than not. So, if I'm the Celtics, right, and I'm viewing this Jaden Springer move as an opportunity to fill out one final role in this roster, I have a lot of ways to go. I think that if you look at how the Celtics play as a team, you're probably thinking it would be smarter to get a cheap option like a Curry, like a Craig, who can help in that department and ultimately space the floor a little bit more for this rotation of centers. But if you feel like the center depth is lacking and you're feeling iffy about the health and age of both Porzingis and Horford as your primary front court players, then you start to think about potentially who you could pick up on the free agent market in the center position. There are not many elite free agent centers we've been talking about this a lot, the GSMC Dead Ball Sports podcast, in the network itself, in terms of what the Lakers are going to do at the center position without, Anthony Davis. But I do think that if I'm the Boston Celtics, standing pat wouldn't necessarily be the worst option in this situation. You have that 14th player available to you, and you can fill it whatever way you want. But in the end, what matters is that this 4-game winning streak is buying you a little bit more time, right? It's buying you a little bit more time to reconsider whether or not you want a depth piece. And while a lot of the production they've gotten in this 4-game winning streak has primarily come from their starting rotation, I still feel like standing pat and basically filling this role with a random guy isn't necessarily the worst option, because that's the kind of move I think that a lot of Celtics fans expected them to make by trading Jaden Springer in cost-cutting ways. Because this is a Celtics team that's more concerned about maintaining the starting rotation, second apron be damned, and keeping this championship window as open as possible than being worried about the depth. Because, in their opinion, they're still an elite NBA team that can compete for Larry O'Brien trophies for as long as Tatum and Brown are there. But the way I see it, that 14th player could be vital in terms of, looking at other teams around the league who are going to test you with their depth. So if I'm the Celtics, I like that I'm at the trade deadline, at the place I'm at, having won 4 games straight. But it's how they're going to view this 14th player that's going to matter. Because I feel like this is an operation that's been very well run, whether it's Danny Ainge or Brad Stevens at the helm of it. And no matter what, they're going to try and find true ways to win this team. But I think that they are just too reliant on this core to get things done, especially in the long run, to try and really make an impact through just one player as a depth option. So I think that if they take it seriously, this could pay dividends for the Celtics. They add a nice depth piece that really balances out their bench units. And if it's a guy like I said, Curry or Craig, who are elite outside shooters, the better for it, because that's who they are as a team. They love to shoot the three. But if they don't, I would not be that concerned, just because I'm looking at this roster right now and how they're playing and saying, well, who's to say they need anyone of note, whether it's bench player or not, to supplement their squad. So it's a very interesting conundrum, if you know what I'm saying, made even more intriguing by this Jaden Springer news in terms of their cost-cutting deals. But let me know what you think if you're a Boston Celtics fan like myself, because that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. My name, as always, is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. But we'll be back tomorrow, same time as always. Like, follow, subscribe, super chat, super thanks, and super stickers features are always available to you if you feel so inclined, as well as the website gsmcpodcast.net. Leave a comment if you'd like. I'm out for today. See y'all tomorrow. Peace.